Thank you again for being here, and welcome again, Dr. Walter Brueggemann.
Well, I'm grateful for you all hanging in all Sabbath morning, and it's a very generous fact that Lisa and Alan, even though they finished their assignment, they've stayed. Astonishing. Not getting CEUs, that's what they are, CEU. You have to prove you're here. I was recently at a Baptist church in Knoxville, and a faculty member at Carson Newman College required students to go, and they had to bring home the leaflet. And an usher told me that for one of the evening lectures, 2 students came in and grabbed the leaflet and walked out the door. And he went after them and retrieved the leaflets. Said, you can't have that unless you stayed. So they went up and got their 2 classmates, and all 4 of them came back in and stayed. You don't want to ever underestimate coercion. Well, just as the poets had anticipated, the end did come in Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, the temple was razed, the king was deported, and it was easy to conclude in that moment that God's promises were no longer sustainable to Israel. And maybe it is like that for us now. Maybe it is symbolized by 9/11. Maybe it is enacted in economic collapse, about which everybody knows now, except the banks. Maybe it was performed in Newtown, Connecticut, or now in Boston. Maybe we have come to an ending of what was. We are not going back, and it is not coming back, and no amount of wish or violence will bring it back. That's sort of the big pause in the middle of the Hebrew Bible. So there was a plunge into despair. In Isaiah 40, second Isaiah is a text we all love because it's mainly the script for Hannah's Messiah. But of course, you skip over some of these verses. You always skip over the hard verses. When you read a lectionary, and it says the reading is verses 1 to 3, 7a and 16b, somebody's doing a job. In Isaiah 40, verse 27, my way is hidden from God, my cause is disregarded. Isaiah quotes that so that he's quoting something that must have been a liturgy, perhaps something like the book of Lamentations, which is mostly unrelieved grief. Or in Isaiah 49:14 that I mentioned last night, Israel, Zion said, quote, in the book of Lamentations, and you can find this quote at the end of the book of Lamentations, Yahweh has forgotten us, Yahweh has forsaken us. In Isaiah 50, verse 2, it doesn't say Yahweh's hand is, he said Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a strong arm and an outstretched hand. And here, Yahweh is saying, do you think my hand is short that I cannot save? Which means somebody must have said Yahweh's hand is short that he cannot save. So we don't have the lament, we have a response to it. And in Isaiah 37:11, Israel says, our bones are dried up, our hope we are completely cut off. So with us, there's enough about which to despair, violence, and then nostalgia, and then privatization. But then in the midst of this deep despair that's grounded in reality, there is in Israel an eruption of new poetry. Well, I didn't take long on despair. I want to talk about the new poetry. And for Christians, that's how the gospel works. Hope and gospel possibility just erupt. That's how we confess Friday and then Sunday Easter. Wow! So here's a poem by Amos Wilder, who was a New Testament teacher at Harvard, who was the brother of Thornton Wilder, who did Our Town. Listen to this. Just 4 lines, or 3 lines, depending on how you read it. Accept no mitigation. I mean, don't water it down, don't make it easy. But be instructed by the null point. And get this. The zero breeds new algebra. Isn't that wonderful? Well, we are at the null point, and we want to mitigate it. So after the Boston Marathon, it took President Obama 10 minutes to go over there and say, we're past this, we're going to succeed, we're going to triumph. That's mitigation. Didn't give us time to pause. But says Wilder, there is a breeding. A poet has to find the right word. There is breeding, which is a hidden, slow, unmanageable process of new life. The zero breeds new algebra. So you can't do the old calculations. And I think all of these incredible poetic promises from the prophets that are filled with hope, they're all dated by critical scholars to the exile. So the exile is this incredible season of displacement and despair and destruction. And in such circumstances, in ways we don't understand, the great promises of the Hebrew Bible all emerge and get voiced. And the burden of all of these promises is to say God is about to work a newness. Now you mustn't talk the newness too soon. That would be like celebrating Easter on Friday. It's totally inappropriate. But there does come a time for new poetry. And new poetry is an act of imagination that we say is the gift of the Spirit. It is an act of imagination in which there is laid before our eyes and before our ears the shape of new social possibility that is completely inexplicable. Because poets can do all sorts of things that Orthodox theologians and scientists cannot do. So in the book of Jeremiah, the editorial process that we don't know about has lodged all of these wonderful Jeremiah promises. And you can imagine the psalmist, oh, I don't think that's from Jeremiah. I think that's from someone else by the same name or whatever. Those in chapters 29 to 33. And the best known of these for Christians is Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, which has been used for supersessionist purposes in the letter to the Hebrews. The days are coming, that means we don't know when, but it's for sure. The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not which is what the old prophets talked about. But a new covenant in which the Torah will be written on their hearts, and they shall all know me from the youngest to the oldest, and I will forgive their sin, and I will remember their iniquity no more. The newness that God will work after the 0 hour is a newness that is grounded in God's forgiveness. Don't you wonder how we Christians missed it in the Old Testament? We said it was a word of law. So what happens in the 6th century exile, according to these poets, is that God is pushed in new directions. God breaks beyond the book of Deuteronomy. And it turns out that God loves Israel even more than God loves Torah. They broke the Torah, but I love Israel. So Jeremiah, who is a child of the Sinai tradition, he's a Torah guy. He is committed to Torah. But he can now imagine the new emergent community of Judaism, that it will be a community that is not in incongruity with the Torah. It will be a community that everybody wants to obey the Torah. Everybody wants to be right with God. Everybody wants to practice neighborhood. Everybody has gladly signed on. Now, of course, when you trace through Judaism, it didn't all work out so cleanly. But that's what poets do. Poets imagine us through the facts on the ground and out beyond to new possibilities. It turns out very differently in the book of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel is a big steeple pastor. He's a priest. So he imagines the future to be a new temple. And he's got 8, 9 detailed, punctilious chapters about how the new temple is going to look. You remember that God flew away from the temple because it was such a profane place. But then Ezekiel, in his imaginative poetry, says, if you listen, you can hear the wings of the cherubim flying back. Here's an airborne God coming on the ark, and will take up residence again in the Jerusalem temple, and the doors will be shut, and Yahweh will never leave again. In fact, the last word of the book of Ezekiel is to say, you now call the new holy city, Adonai is there. Is there. So at the center of the new community for Ezekiel is not Torah, it's temple. And in chapter 47, he has this incredible vision of the new temple that is the source of life, because you remember that in the earlier tradition, the waters of life flew out of the Garden of Eden into 4 rivers. But now the waters of life will flow out from under the altar of the new temple. And Ezekiel notices that water of life. And he puts a foot into the water of life, and it was ankle deep, and he takes another step, and it was the water of life was knee deep, and he takes another step, and the water of life was hip deep. And as he watches and imagines, he sees the water of life flowing into the Dead Sea, which I think in the Emeritus is called the stagnant sea. And the water is so fresh and so life-giving that there are fish in the Dead Sea again. Because creation has started over from the bottom up with the waters of life that depend on the new temple. Isaiah is a city guy. He's a Jerusalem guy. So here's the scenario. of the newness that God will now work is that there will be a new heaven and, Isaiah 65, a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. And I wonder what it felt like that day when he went home to lunch after he had conjured chapter 65 and he said to whoever fixed lunch for him, I wrote a hell of a poem. So the poem lines out the new city. Last night as I lay sleeping, I had a dream so fair. My wife said, "You're not going to do that, are you?" I just heard on the radio this week, I live in Cincinnati, that infant mortality is, the rate is rising in Ohio, which means we don't take care of babies. But Isaiah in 65 says there will be no infant mortality. All the babies will be valued in the new city. There will be health care for everyone, even a sinner who lives to be 120 years old. So there's no telling how long good people will live. And then he says, you will not build another inhabit. You will not plant another. There will be no foreclosures. You will not lose your property to the mechanisms of rapacious economics. You will be safe and you will live under your vine and your fig tree, and nobody will disturb that shalom. And then he says this attending mother God. It's masculine term, but it's a mother image. You know how mothers say in the middle of the night before the child cries, "Oh, did you call? Did you call? I thought I heard you." But God says, before you call, I will answer you. And there will be no hurt or trouble in the new city and in the new creation. So the Canonical Committee of rabbis, whoever they were, gave us these three big prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. You know, there was an exam in seminary, and the student was sure that the test question was going to be named the 20 kings of Israel. So he memorized them and had them cold, and he got there, and the test question was name 3 major prophets and 3 minor prophets, and he had a clue. So he wrote, it behooves me to say who's major and minor among them, but if you want the 20 kings of Israel, they are. but notice the canon, it's pluralistic. So Jeremiah dreams Torah, that must be for rural Republicans. And Ezekiel dreams temple, that must be for church bureaucrats. And Isaiah dreams city, that's for Wall Street people. There are many ways to dream, and no dream needs to defeat the other because they are all dreams of well-being. And you can see in the latter chapters of Isaiah that after they had these wonderful dream poems, then they started to say, how do we practice that? How do we get to that? And in chapter 56, you can see that they had an argument about who are the real disciples of Christ, who are the real Presbyterians, who are the real Jews. And this text says, well, welcome the foreigners, welcome the eunuchs, welcome all the people that are unlike us. All we got to do is practice Sabbath and covenant. Because my house shall be a house of prayer for all people. So it's an argument about inclusion of the other. In chapter 58, they had a debate about what constitutes right worship. And the poem castigates people who do punctilious worship and they pay cheap wages to their laborers. And then that text that we trot out on Ash Wednesday, is not the fast to which I summon you to share your bread with the hungry and to clothe the naked and bring your own flesh into your house. Is not the fast that I want you to do the practice of neighborliness? And in Isaiah 61, there is a proposal for a new economics. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord's favor, which most interpreters view as the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is a radical subversion of all conventional economics. These are very dangerous poems. These are poems about Torah, about temple, about new city. They're all poems that say, no more business as usual, no more conventional certitudes, no more habits that keep us bound to failure. And as you know, Isaiah announced that the Jews would be brought home from Babylon by the permission of a goy, Cyrus. 45:1, Isaiah calls Cyrus the goy, my Messiah, for God's sake. And there must have been Jews in Babylon who said, I ain't going home with a goy. If God can't meet us home with a Jew, this ain't going. They must have said that because in Isaiah 45:9, the poet says, does the clay quarrel with the potter? Does the clay say to the potter, I don't think you got your hands right? No, the clay just keeps turning. Then the next verse says, does the semen say to the father, what are you doing there? Does the embryo say to the mother, how come you're grunting so much? They just keep moving. So if the clay has to keep moving, the embryo has to keep moving, Israel has to keep moving. Because Israel will be led, says this poet, in ways that seem odd and uncomfortable and inconvenient and awkward. But this whole corpus of eruptive poetry wants to say newness is coming. And it ain't going to wait on you. It's coming, and it's here, and we ain't going back to the old Jerusalem or the old Torah or the old temple. We're going back to newness. So I propose, as we read these texts, that we have to entertain the new algebra. We have to think about the new world to which God is leading us. It is a world shaped and occupied in ways that do not feel very comfortable to people like me. I saw a gun lobby nut on television the other day who said he was ready to start killing. They had this clip of him because he said he did not want the new world order. I think he thinks the new world order is some kind of conspiracy of communists or socialists or someone like that. But of course the new world order is simply demography, and the drift of power to new foci. And we don't get to vote on it. We find ourselves in the middle of it the way Jews found themselves in the middle of new Torah and new temple and new city. So there is a reason that Old Testament scholarship has long seen this fissure around the destruction of Jerusalem between what is conveniently called ancient Israel and Judaism. There are all kinds of continuities, but there are deep turns to the new algebra so that you can't just replicate and reiterate old Israel. So you can't replicate and reiterate old church or old Western culture or old United States. Because, as the letter to the Hebrews says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And then as you go, Hebrews 11 says, by faith, Abraham, by faith, Isaac, by faith, by faith, by faith. These all kept on, though they did not arrive. And then the last two verses of that long chapter, Hebrews 11, says, whether they will be made perfect, these by faith people, all depends on you. So I like to think it's like a bowling score. I don't know much about bowling, but I think sometimes you don't know what your score is in a frame until 2 frames later. That depends on what you fill out for a strike or a spare or whatever. So faith is like a bowling score. All of these great saints who risked their life depend on our readiness to seek a new, continuing city. Jerry is an old guy in our church. He's older than I am. And he's so rich that he just bought the organ when we needed one. And my pastor said not long ago he saw Jerry, and Jerry had tears in his eyes. Our pastor always says, what's up? I guess he learned that in CPE training. What's up? That's a version of how are things going. And Jerry said with tears in his eyes, I want my world back. Well, so do we all, who were white, tenured, and male and Gentile. Well, one are straight. And it's not available. So, that led me to be thinking about what is God's new future for us. I think that's the question we now have to dwell on, and I have my thoughts about that. And you may have your thoughts about it, but we need to think about that. The emergence of Judaism with Ezra and Nehemiah, Malachi, we're all asking, what's going to be like back in Jerusalem? What's going to be like now? So it's going to be like that. What's going to be like? So I thought of these things, the new world that is emerging before our eyes as a gift from God is a world in which there will and must be room for others who are unlike us. And that's hard. Because those of us who are white, tenured, male, Christian, straight, have assumed that we were the normative people in the world. I read a book recently about what was called in the 19th century world religions. And this author showed that in the 19th century, when people started cataloging Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, the big five, that the purpose of that was to show that Western Protestantism was the superior religion. So we studied the others to show that they were inadequate, particularly the two Semitic religions. And would you believe, Alan, that the argument made in the 19th century is that the reason Judaism and Islam is inferior is that you cannot inflect the verbs adequately. Well, apparently they never studied Pual, PL, Kifal, Hofal, Ifmael. That's the argument they made. God's new future is the loss of our world hegemony. China. And it's almost like we've had a moment of sanity under Chuck Hagel was saying, we're not going to spend ourselves into bankruptcy. But then the right wing is going to come along and say, who gave away the world that was ours? Because the loss of hegemony means, does it not, that all the money doesn't flow in here anymore. So the new world, where God has put us, means a lower standard of living. Well, now we're back to the common good. So we're having big arguments about how those with a lot of money, how much they have to contribute to the common good in order that the lowest standard of living doesn't have to be so low that it is unbearable. Or the new world in which God is putting us means that for the first time we are now having to think about the creation, and we cannot violate the creation just to keep our consumer economy growing. So we will reach the end of our capacity with chemicals to manipulate the environment for our convenience. The new world to which God is bringing us is the end of the old entitlements and the unfettered freedom of white males. And it is coming. And the last thing I can think of, you can make your list. A new ecumenism requires that we reformulate our absolutes. That's not the same as giving up our absolutes, but we have to reformulate them. Because we notice that every time some other is admitted into the room, we have to say it a bit differently. That's what's been so important, to get one woman at the table. Because one woman in the room means you can't just do guy talk. One black in the room means you can't just do white talk. One Jew in the room means you can't go on talking the same way about the Lordship of Jesus Christ. One gay person in the congregation means you can't say it differently. So those of us who are Christians will stay close to Jesus forever. But the new ecumenism requires us to say that differently and to soften the tone of our Christological absolutism. And what I want to suggest to you is that the church is the midwife and the therapist in the great hard task of relinquishing the world that is gone and receiving a new world that has come upon us, on which we didn't get to vote. It is indeed a new algebra, and it is coming soon and hard. And what they knew in the edge of emerging Judaism is you can't just move from old to new Judaism just like that. But you have to pause. You have to pause to grieve the loss. So what they did was to put the book of Lamentations right down into the middle of the history of Judaism, which is 5 long chapters of grief. And the church is the only community, the synagogue and the church, are the only communities to practice grief work. day after 9/11, George Bush gets up in the National Cathedral, announces a new crusade for Americanism. 10 minutes after the Boston Marathon, President Obama gets up and announces, we're going to win. Nothing should come that quickly. That is why the calendar of the last days of Jesus must have been Friday, Saturday, 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 Sunday. George Steiner, a great Jewish intellectual, this Promethean figure of thought, ends one of his books by saying that Christians know that there is a long Friday dying. He says everybody knows that, Jews know that. He says Christians know that there is an impossibly joyous Sunday. He says everybody knows that, Jews know that. And he says, between that long Friday of dying and that amazing Sunday of rejoicing, there is Saturday. So we are in a Saturday. We're in a Saturday of not knowing. We're in a Saturday of relinquishing loss and honestly grieving and naming what we have lost, because by Saturday night, we call it vigil, by Saturday night the new poems begin. New poems about city, about temple, about Torah. Saturday is the breeding ground for the new algebra, and it is our proper work.